Hello, this is Nathan Hanamaikai, and this is my presentation on Chapter 13, When Leadership is an Organizational Trait, by James O'Toole. In this chapter, James O'Toole discusses the idea of leadership as an individual trait, and how that's really an American obsession. There seems to be less focus on leadership as a trait, or as an individual trait in other countries than here in America. In America, we focus on it as an individual trait, but in other places, it's more of an organizational trait. This American obsession with individual leadership tends to skew the analysis away from organizational factors, which are, in fact, the more important drivers of performance, which is something that O'Toole states in the book. It draws our attention away from maybe the more important factors, the organizational factors of leadership that drive performance of the organization as a whole. Not necessarily the organization of an individual, but considering the organization as a whole, it's more of a trait at an organizational level. Through O'Toole's research, the research revealed that the relative performance of large corporations cannot be explained adequately by measuring the leadership traits of the leader. Now, with this in mind, just make note of that word adequate. It doesn't adequately describe it. It does, to some extent, prove the performance, related a little bit to the performance of the corporation, but it doesn't adequately explain it. One of the things that O'Toole found through his research of the companies that were in his project was this idea of cascading leadership. Cascading leadership is kind of like this. If you've ever seen a waterfall that's a cascade, it starts here at the top and starts from a more central point, but as it trickles down, it spreads out into other areas. And he likens this to how successful organizations view leadership. There's a central point of momentum, so to speak. It all comes from one source, but its delivery ends up being diffused across the entire organization. Maybe a better example, I don't know if you've ever seen this. This is another example of a cascade waterfall in Vietnam. I actually went to Google Earth to look at the river that leads into this, and it is in fact one large river, and it comes to this point where it cascades from the point of inception into hundreds of different little waterfalls that produce this kind of effect. So this idea of cascading leadership is that it comes from one source, but it continues on to diffuse among different levels of the organization. The next idea that he presents really is talking about leadership tasks and responsibilities, which I'll abbreviate as TAR. I like the analogy of tar because if you've ever seen the La Brea tar pits, you know what tar looks like. If you've ever seen tar in any of its forms, when it's cold, it's really, really, really viscous. It's really thick. But when it warms up, it moves pretty fluidly. This really is likened to a sole leader in an organization where there's just one body generating heat. So it's relatively viscous, but as you diffuse those responsibilities and tasks across a larger organization, the temperature, so to speak, of the tasks and the responsibilities, or the tar, tends to be more fluid, and things get done more quickly. And what is important to note here is that the key leadership tar is institutionalized within the organization's systems, practices, and cultures. He found that as being more important than the individual leadership style. The tasks and responsibilities of the TAR are not embodied only or always in the leader. Now, I say only or always because this means that the tasks and responsibilities are not just the responsibility of the leader, and sometimes the leader of the organization doesn't even embody the best practices of carrying out tasks and responsibilities. So it is sometimes not always even in the leader of the organization. A little bit more on this idea of institutionalized TAR. In organizations where the TAR are institutionalized, you see people within the organization that act more like owners and entrepreneurs instead of just employees. They take more initiative to solve problems. They act with more urgency. They're more willing to accept accountability, and they accept they willingly live the organizational values. They share a common philosophy of leadership, which embraces contrary views and a willingness to experiment and try new things. And this is they also create, maintain, and adhere to systems and procedures designed to measure and reward these distributed leadership behaviors. He brings up the example of how sometimes there are organizations that lead out, but they have completely different leadership styles. Oracle, for example, he brings up as being led by a sole leader, but that sole leader is very energized. He leads the organization well, and he compares it ironically to Enron. Yes, I said Enron. They had a diffused leadership style, and I'll touch on that a little bit more later. So this idea of is leadership an individual trait or an organizational trait? He likens a couple times to whether or not is a solo appropriate, is a soloist appropriate, or is a choral number more appropriate for leading an organization. And unfortunately, a lot of the previous research and publication have pointed us to the age-old MBA answer, it depends. But he brings up these questions that I found really insightful. If leadership were solely an individual trait, then why do some companies show continued innovation, etc., regardless of who is at the helm? Why do some CEOs succeed at one but not another organization? Why do some companies succeed regardless of lackluster CEOs? And this one I think is pretty interesting. Why can't academics quantify the CEO style to organizational performance relationship? Meaning, why can't they find a correlation between the style of the CEO and the performance of the organization? Why isn't it stronger than just than what they've been finding? If it is an individual trait, then you would expect that correlation would be pretty strong. This is a quote from the book as well I really liked. None of us is as smart as all of us. This is the idea that the lone genius is not as smart or as valuable as the quote-unquote smartness of the entire group. Organizations that thrive off the lone leader style may face a higher chance for failure once that leader is gone. For example, when Steve Jobs went to Pixar. But I pose this question. Can you really consider yourself successful if the organization you leave fails to ruins in your absence? Have you really been a good leader if everything falls apart when you leave? I think the answer to this is no. And if the answer is no, why would you shoulder the burden as the lone leader while you are in leadership? Why wouldn't you try to diffuse the leadership responsibilities across the organization? And this is something that O'Toole brought up as well. He brought up this idea of LQ, how successful companies consciously build their LQ, or leadership quotient, also known as the overall leadership capacity of an organization. The successful companies worry more about what organizational qualities need to be developed versus developing individual leaders. They build leadership capacity within the company. They focus on the organizational leadership needs as opposed to individual room for growth. And it is easier to change organizational processes than it is to change individual traits. It's easier. They're easier to control. They're easier to measure. They're easier to manipulate than pulling people into an executive's office and telling them, okay, you need to be more honest, or you need to work harder, or you need to be smarter. Those things just don't happen overnight. But changing a process to go from point A to point C without going through B is a little bit easier conceptually. On that last slide, I also, when it comes to building LQ, it's something that you have to accept that not everybody can be an Einstein, but everybody can study as hard as he did. Not everybody's going to change the world, but everybody can change the way they are and the way they learn. And in the process, move yourself forward, as I talked about in the last chapter summary, considering yourself as an organization within your own person. So how do you build your organization's leadership capacity? One of the ways that he brings up is using objective data to incite change. His research project had it analyzed over 3,000 leaders, had hundreds of interviews across 3 continents, and they asked questions about 65 measures of behavior on the systems and processes that leaders use to affect behavior. Each respondent was allowed to give 2 scores for each, one rating the leadership above them and one rating the leadership of their peers or somebody on the same level. And this was on a 7-point Likert scale. For example, questions like, this person holds people accountable for their performance. How would they rate that on a 7-point scale? And the 12 organizational systems that they were evaluating were these. What they found is that companies across the board, as a whole, rather, scored abysmal in performance appraisal and decision making, or organizational structure. In other words, the top management wasn't holding operating heads to their commitments, and decision making was more based on relationships. In other words, they were playing favorites. They also discovered that there was a concrete layer, a layer within the organization that was keeping communication from moving to the ground floor, to the operational level. And they found ways that by identifying that enabled the organization to find ways to get the communication to the people that needed the information. The 2 ideas of coherence and agility tend to be at cross purposes with each other, but they are necessary according to O'Toole. Coherence is defined as, according to O'Toole, common behaviors found throughout an organization that are directed toward the achievement of shared goals, meaning that everybody works together. Agility is the institutionalized ability to detect and cope successfully with changes in the external environment, especially when such changes are difficult to anticipate. The leaders of successful companies viewed their primary task as building both of these. Not one or the other, but they needed to work together. Then he brought up this idea of examining the enabling systems within an organization, of which there were these 4, and for lack of time, I'll buzz through these a little bit. Goal setting and planning had to be fair. It had to be a fair process. Risk management, everybody needed to understand what the key risks were, all the way up and down the chain, all the way to the person on the production floor. Communications were imperative, and the recruiting had to be in tandem with what the organizational goals were. Then this idea of consciously chosen, he really emphasized that there wasn't a strong correlation between which of the 12 areas you chose, but that you consciously chose 12 of these areas, or a couple of these areas to focus on. Because leadership is a process, not a trait. So, here are the discussion questions, and I look forward to your responses. Have a good night.